We come to Berlin, we American presidents, because it's our duty to speak in this place of freedom. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Dr. Tasha Golden is a speaker, consultant, and internationally recognized leader in the science of creativity and well-being. Named one of 2024's Fierce 50 by Fierce Pharma for her innovative work integrating arts and healthcare, she has supported paradigm shifts in health and well-being, exemplified by leadership in Arts on Prescription, a model of care that's reshaping how health is defined and created. Holding a PhD in public health, Dr. Golden's work is informed by her history as a singer-songwriter, founder of Project Uncaged, which is for trauma-informed program for incarcerated youth, and developer of How We Human, a mental health training for creatives. Bringing research and action, Dr. Golden's unique frameworks help leaders grow their work and ignite positive change. And I am just thrilled that she's here sharing her wisdom and insights with us. Dr. Golden, welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, listen, the intro was very, very brief. What more do we need to know about Dr. Tasha Golden? And I think we're all particularly interested in how does a singer-songwriter end up in your current profession?
Yeah, I don't think it's the typical, there's not like the singer-songwriter to health scientist pipeline usually, although maybe that's changing recently, but I never imagined being a scientist or doing research, doing the work that I'm doing now as a really young girl. The job I dreamt of doing was being a singer and traveling the world, playing my songs. And that is the work I got to do for many years. I toured full time, had songs in TV and film. I thought that I would be doing that work until I died, till I couldn't do it anymore. And what happened, though, was that I had songs about, the things that I wrote about are wide-ranging, but they included songs about things like my own history of depression or my family's history of domestic violence. And I just found that all over the world, those were the songs that people lined up after concerts wanting to talk to me about. And they would share with me their own stories about suicide ideation, mental illness, abuse histories. And many of them followed up their stories by saying, I'm the first person they had ever told. And, wow. I was thinking, I couldn't help thinking, if I'm the first person they'd ever told, that's a great honor to me in my life. But also that means that they've never told a doctor or a therapist, not even a spouse or partner. And yeah. I started to think about, wow, what do we not know about so many populations and experiences? Because people cannot or will not share about their experiences in the ways that we typically expect of them. That there are reasons that humans have evolved to make and share art, and part of that has to do with the ways that we communicate our lived experience. So I got really curious about, exactly what I said. What do we not know? What happens when we leave art out of our other essential spaces, whether that's healthcare or education, workplaces, even our homes? And what is it about art that makes people able to say things that they don't say otherwise? And anyway, I pulled on the threads of those questions till I wound up with a PhD in public health, specializing in the effects of arts and creativity on our well-being, on how we think, what we know, what we share. And led to my work in research and consulting now.
Well, thank you for that. I don't think it is the typical, progression, but it all makes sense based upon your experiences as you relate them. Well, listen, I always try and level set the audience right up front. Like I said, the intro is brief. I'm assuming they know nothing about you. So I always ask all guests, what do you do professionally? Who do you help? And how do you help them?
Well, it has taken many different shapes over time, but what I do professionally, I speak and consult on the intersections of creativity with well-being and with growth and leadership. So what does it mean to think creatively? What are the ways that we can do that? And how does that change the ways that we've my special focus has been on how does thinking creatively change the typical ways that we do things. So that the typical ways that we think healthcare should be run, for example, the typical ways that we might approach education, the typical ways we might design a workplace, or the typical expectations we might have of employees, things like that. If we were able to think creatively, and if we knew a little bit about how arts and aesthetics and our environments affect us, affect how we think, affect how we feel, then what might we change? So love to be able to share, to kind of make sense of the research for people in practical terms so that they can make decisions more knowledgeably and especially more creatively about how they want to do their work.
Thank you for that. Well, I have two questions, standard questions I ask every guest. And the first is, if we were an elevator and I asked you for your elevator pitch, 2, 3, 4 sentences, what's your philosophy on leadership? So I would like that. And it's okay if you focus that on your philosophy of leadership relative to creativity. Your choice, whether you want to give the version A or the version B, but I think people would love to hear, your philosophy of leadership.
Yeah. 2 or 3 sentences. I think if I had to distill it, I would say that creative leadership is an ability to question the way that things are and the way that they have been, not just for the sake of being somebody who's questioning or being provocative or contrarian, but like, how can I re-see the way that things are, reimagine them so that I can create and help build something new. So I think that that's at the core of creative leadership. I will say, though, I think that there are different types of leadership, and those different types can benefit from different philosophies. People find themselves enriched and incentivized by different types of insights and ideas. So, my work is typically targeted toward the creative leadership side.
Well said. Thank you. The next question is, I always ask them the timeless question, are leaders born or made? And for you, I'll throw the word creative in there. The classic question, are creative leaders born or made?
I think it's fun that you ask this, because people also ask this often about art and artists. Are great artists born or made? And I always think I'm neurodivergent, Mike, and I often am kind of like perceiving questions differently than other people. It took me a while to notice this about myself, but I often think when people ask that question that they're asking something else, that this question is sort of hiding for them. And I think the question a lot of people are asking is, if I'm not already a great creative leader, can I become one? I think that's actually what that's the only reason why we would ask that question, right? And I think it's very clear that, yes, you can become a great leader. And I also think that some of the things that might be innate, that people might look to that and be like, oh, that person was born a great leader. I think some of those things can be a little bit suspect if we zoom out and look at them. Like, do you mean that the person has a lot of charisma? Do you mean that they're gregarious and outgoing? Those things are only good for leadership if we're taking our followers in a direction that is good. You might say moral, ethical, valuable, So some of the things that might seem like they're innate in people, I don't know if we can attach those to good leadership. It depends on how you're defining good leadership, right?
Yeah. No, thank you. I love it. Well, listen, during the research for this interview, I went on your LinkedIn page and I found a very intriguing post that you recently put up there. And so for the audience, I'm going to read this post verbatim, and I quote, James Baldwin reminds us, and you're quoting somebody here, James Baldwin reminds us, the artist cannot and must not take anything for granted, but must drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides, end quote. And then you continue and you say, for all of us seeking to lead change, Baldwin's words are a call to action. Drive to the heart of what you think you know. Expose the questions behind your ready, obvious answers. Re-examine your most entrenched, accepted views. Illuminate and reshape them. This is how our most crucial creative practice, the practice of imagining otherwise, of questioning how it is, generates bold goals and new paths. So as we wrap up 2024, here are 5 questions to help you dig in. And these are the 5 questions. Question 1, what are some answers that stand in the way of the bold questions that transform your work? Question 2, what could become possible if the assumed rules and boundaries of your work, role, or industry didn't exist? What partnerships would you make? What impacts could you have? Question 3, list a few obviously true assumptions you hold about your career and your role, your industry, or your impact. What questions could you ask to challenge these and open up new possibilities? Question 4, what assumptions do you hold about your own capabilities and potential? How might these be limiting your growth and creativity? And question 5, what's one norm or accepted premise in your work that you commit to reimagining in the coming year? What steps will you take to do so? So I love the questions, and I can see that, I'm just chomping at the bit to hear you. So let's start with the first question and go as wide and as deep on any of these, Dr. Golden. So the first question is, what are some answers that stand in the way of the bold questions that could transform your work?
Yeah, well, I should say, James Baldwin, a masterful writer, civil rights leader. I'd look to him so much in creative leadership, but his call to, drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides. I think it's a call in some ways to re-examine what we think of as expertise, because of course expertise can do so much for us, but it can also make us draw a mental map of our world, and we say, here's how it is, and then we no longer ask any questions. We sort of like label something and move on. And I think that creative leadership happens when we can step back into the question, maybe take on a beginner's mind, but even without beginner's mind, just be like, what have we labeled here and moved on from that isn't necessarily set in stone? How can we go back to the things that we've said, yeah, that's how it is, we've answered that question, we're over it, whatever. What if you went back to those questions and re-examined them and said, okay, we have some answers, that's fine, we can build on those answers, but are those the inevitable answers? Are those the only answers? Are those the optimal answers? In what ways are we, sometimes with my clients, I'm talking about the importance of questioning the premise with a capital Q and capital P, like question the premise. What premises have we accepted here? Because we've answered all these questions that actually, if we could go back and re-examine it, we might wind up with something new.
I love it. Well, that leads into the next one. Next question is, what could become possible if the assumed rules and boundaries of your work, role, or industry didn't exist? What partnerships would you make? What impacts could you have?
Yeah, I started thinking a lot about this question in particular with my work in arts on prescription. And if listeners aren't familiar with that, is exactly what it sounds like. Right now in the US, also other countries in the world, but in the US, there are physicians, mental health therapists, school counselors who are literally prescribing arts and culture activities in the community in order to benefit their patients or their clients' health. And what I have loved about, researching that work, researching its effectiveness, how it plays out, how people build these into their community healthcare systems, et cetera. What I love about that is that it has required people to reimagine what they think health is and who they think contributes to it and how they think it's created. And a lot of times, like I mentioned about the premise, we have these kind of assumed, unquestioned, unarticulated quote unquote rules that we live by. Like, this is what, for example, this is what a visit to my doctor entails. This is what I get from it. This is what I wind up doing for my health. And over time, we've seen that those can shift. Before the 1980s, there wasn't a huge focus on, for example, fitness and movement and exercise for your health. That's something that shifted very much culturally based on research and other things. So we know that these change over time, but we can, as leaders, get ahead of the curve sometimes if we're willing to say, oh, wait, what have I, again, the premises, what have I accepted? And what rules aren't even written rules, or sometimes they are formal rules. What rules have we made about how our industry has to operate? Or what is it that I do in my job and my role? What books have I read that told me, here's what your role should look like? And I've just eaten that up and accepted it, where actually I might be able to do better work if I saw myself not only as somebody who was really good at following a template, but somebody who is a co-creator of the story that I'm trying to write with my work.
I love that. I love it. Well, listen, what about the third question here? List a few obviously true assumptions you hold about your career, role, or industry, or your impact. What questions could you ask to challenge these and open up new possibilities? And obviously, to remind the audience, this is what Dr. Golden would be asking of leaders to contemplate asking themselves these questions.
Yeah. What are some obviously true assumptions that you hold about your work and your impact, and how might you challenge those? And the goal isn't to, I think for people who have been leaders for a long time, sometimes this can feel a little bit threatening might be too strong a word, but it can feel a little bit threatening because people can kind of think like, well, if I question what I've been doing, doesn't that threaten my knowledge, my expertise? Doesn't that make me kind of vulnerable? Doesn't that kind of imply that I haven't known what I was doing up until now? I've made some mistakes. I've misperceived something. And, you can make it mean that if you want to, if that's helpful to you. I find that it's not always helpful. It can be helpful to let yourself be vulnerable, to remind yourself that none of us are infallible. But I think another interpretation of it is that like we are all dynamic, we are all changing, and we can always ask questions of the work that we're doing, of the systems that we're part of the institutions that we're part of the culture that we're part of, the societies that we're part of, and say, what is real here? What is undeniable? How might I reimagine this if I, again, saw myself not simply as somebody who was accepting everything as it is, but as somebody who was co-creating that? What would I create with and that can include your career, your industry, your field, your role. What would that role look like if you were a co-creator of it versus somebody who's really good at doing what you're told and fulfilling the work that you've been trained to do exactly as you've been trained to do it, And it's important to do your work as you've been trained to do it in some contexts, right? But some of us get really stuck in either there's a level of confidence that we have and like, well, this is how I've been told to do it. And I know if I do this way, I'll get praised for that, or I'll get rewarded for that. Or I know, or at least know where that leads because I've seen other people do it that way. And when you break out of that and do something on your own, there's a little bit more uncertainty there. But I think we also find a lot of our boldest visions and our greatest changes for our own personal lives and for the world at large come from the people who are willing to say, let me ask some questions around this. And I will say some people ask questions and they come right back to doing exactly what they were doing before. But now it's grounded in their own exploration and they kind of have a different kind of ownership of what they're doing because they're doing it for reasons that they've established for themselves versus simply because that's what they were told to do. And then some people ask questions and they wind up finding a different path for their work, or at least how it manifests.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the next question, number 4, is what assumptions do you hold about your own capabilities and potential? How might these be limiting your growth and creativity?
Yeah, I think it's not uncommon in leadership circles for people to talk about things like limiting beliefs. What is it? What caps have you put on your own potential and your own success? Maybe even without realizing it, subconsciously or unconsciously, you're saying, well, I can attain this. And a lot of times that can be rooted in, childhood or what your parents might have taught you, or you just like maybe unconsciously don't perceive yourself as having more success than the people in the community you grew up with. Or maybe it's, your assumptions that I can only achieve as much as my mentor did, or as much as I see my peers that are a couple steps ahead of me, I can be as good as them. And we're not seeing these necessarily as limiting beliefs. We're just kind of unconsciously assenting to a certain kind of narrative about our lives and our potential. And so, like I said, I don't think that the idea of identifying our limiting beliefs is unique, but I think if we can approach that work from a point of view of creativity, of saying like, I'm not just trying to identify limiting beliefs so that I can achieve more and do more, but how can I identify limiting beliefs so that I can help myself recognize that the story I'm telling about my life is just one story, that it is a story. Number one, it's not just an objective truth, and that there are other stories that are available. And that not only helps us to maybe pursue a greater potential with our own lives, our relationships, our careers, our leadership, et cetera, but that can open us up to be far more creative in what we look for from the people who are following us, who are taking our leadership, and then also what we can look for and expect and demand of the broader world, of society, of policies and politics, much more.
Right, right. Well, listen, question number 5. What's one norm or accepted premise in your work that you commit to reimagining in the coming year? What steps will you take to do so?
Yeah, this is so necessary for people who want to be able to grow their work. And it's not just about how can you think outside the box, but there are people who hit problems in their field. In the arts, for example, it can be like, society doesn't really value the arts. It's being taken out of our schools. So, here's the problems that we have. We lack funding and things like that. And that can all be absolutely true. Like in the arts, I would never argue with my colleagues that are at arts institutions scrambling for funding, right? That they're correct in their assessment of that being a problem, but also the way that you characterize a problem or narrate a problem will kind of predetermine the types of solutions that you come up with. So within, recognizing an objective problem such as funding in the arts, what might that be coming from? Is it true that everybody devalues the arts? Who's everybody? In what ways is that devaluing happen? What is affecting it? So that's one example. But for anybody who's listening, if you've run into a problem in your own career or in your industry, recognizing that there might be some kind of norm or accepted premise about, well, here's how it goes, or here's how people respond to us, or here's how you have to do business. And so we're hitting this problem. And it's kind of like, how might you be characterizing that problem or yourself or your field or industry in a way that's keeping you from recognizing potential additional solutions?
Yeah, well, I love it, and this is an ad hoc improvised question. I love these questions. I can see where they would lead many leaders to have an epiphany or multiple epiphanies. First question has that been your experience? Do these questions really result in epiphanies in a good number of leaders? And then let's say the audience is all going to ask themselves these questions and they're going to have that epiphany. What next? If somebody asks these questions and comes up with some really good answers, what's your, what next, Dr. Golden,
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, that the answer to what next is going to be as varied as the individuals in the room, right? Depending on what their work is and what they're up to. But yeah, I've developed a framework over the years, grounded in research and also my experience with individuals who are going through these processes. And sometimes they are people who identify themselves as creative people. They are artists. And sometimes they are people who are like, I'm not creative at all. But, actually, it turns out that they're incredibly creative. They created an entire business, for example. And it's kind of like helping them walk through these processes. But the framework, it begins, there's a few, it's a larger framework, but a few key elements of it are refusal, reimagination, and remaking. And there's a process that you go through of refusing to accept the world as it is, refusing to accept every premise and assumption and norm that you're living with, that these things are changeable, as it turns out. And then reimagination comes after that, as far as once you recognize that things are not inevitable, they're not fated, they're not fixed, they can be changed. There's a requirement to get creative and imaginative around what it could be instead. But of course, if you just have a lot of ideas of what could or should be instead and don't have a sense of what to do about it, then you're kind of either stuck in daydreaming or you're stuck in sometimes despair, right? So the remaking part is how do we take these ideas that we have and put them into action? And sometimes, depending on your role, you have a lot of power and efficacy as far as making massive changes or overhauls, if that's what you wish to do. And then sometimes, depending on your role, these are changes that might get instantiated in nuanced ways. Maybe it's completely outside of your career and your work role. Maybe it's something that you're doing in your life and your community and other aspects. But it's sort of like, how do we pursue the world that we've imagined, pursue the change that we've envisioned? And there's as many ways to do that as there are ideas.
No, I love it. Well, listen, your LinkedIn feed post activity was a gold mine, and so I'm going to quote another one.
Oh.
And in another LinkedIn post, you stated, and I quote, "Creativity is rooted in refusal, the refusal to accept things as they are, and creativity emerges in the gap between what is and what should be." This gap is where we're compelled to imagine and act. And, you mentioned in this post and others something that you call the art of the refusal, which I love. I love that. I love that term, for all it implies and infers. So can you elaborate a little bit for our audience on the art of the refusal? I mean, what is it?
Yes, thank you for asking about this. I have a column in Psychology Today, and my most recent article right now is called "The Art of Refusal," where I'm sort of laying out this idea that, encountering the things that we need or want to refuse about how things currently are. Sometimes people find that situation very uncomfortable. It can be a kind of grief. It can kind of be despair. It can be rage. It can be just, very high levels of discomfort, whatever the case might be. What I've seen in research and practice is that those moments of absolutely challenging emotions, which many people, I was writing about this at the end of the year, the close of 2024, right? And just recognizing that the turn of the year is kind of painted to be this like very shiny, optimistic, hopeful time. But I was recognizing that a lot of people that I was working with were having a very difficult time, facing a lot of uncertainty, facing a lot of challenges. And, recognizing from the science and from psychological science and other aspects that those moments of challenge are actually the beginning of a creative process, because the things that you are angry about, that you're grieving over, tell you a lot about what you value and what you think things should or could be. And that is necessary to create something different. None of us creates change in the world without recognizing that creating change is possible. And so it begins with a kind of refusal to believe that the world is just fine as it is, that everything is inevitable, everything as it is fixed that way, and it has to stay that way. And I have to give an example of, artists, to write a song, to dance, to perform or compose music. These are acts of creation, but they're also acts of refusal, because the artist refusing to believe that the world's just fine as it is, that it doesn't need another song. It doesn't, refusing to believe that I can't be part of contributing something else to the world as it is, right? And so there's the art of refusal is recognizing that the world is not fixed and that we can be part of adding something to it, changing something about it. And that's where all creativity, not only can begin, but must begin.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to ask a follow-on question, and you might have already answered this question whole or in part. So in the same post, you stated, in the art of refusal, I share why challenging emotions can spark creative change, why emphatic no's are at the heart of leadership and growth, and then you have a 5-step framework to help you embrace refusal as a catalyst for reimagining, rebuilding. And I wasn't sure, Dr. Golden, whether that 5-step framework was those 5 questions we just went over, or is it something different?
You're catching me in a I do love a set of 5 things, certainly, but those 5 questions and this 5-step framework are indeed different things. Okay. And, the framework, I will link, I've created a website for listeners of this show, tashagolden.com/Fidelis, and I'll make sure that there's a link to the article in Psychology Today there so that people can go grab this framework, because it's one thing to talk about how, your challenging emotions can help you notice what you think could or should be different about the world. And sometimes a challenging emotion happens because you think things should be different, but they're not going to be, and that can be despair. And sometimes a challenging emotion, like I said, can be rage, can be grieving something, mourning something, can be all over the map. Sometimes it can just be like the difficulty of feeling a lot of anticipation about what's next and our uncertainties that we're facing. But it's one thing to say, hey, that is very challenging, and it can also be part of the creative process. That's not an attempt to silver line it, to say hey, it's fine that you feel these emotions, because after all, you can create now. That is not at all my goal in portraying it this way. It's more just to get back to the science of how, what is the role of our emotions? They are typically messengers that tell us something about ourselves and what we need. And what is the process of creativity? It's always rooted in a desire for change and noticing that change is possible. So anyway, I noticed when I was writing the article, it's one thing to talk about that and present that as a concept. It's another to actually embark upon that. So I wanted to make sure that there was kind of a practical framework that begins with identifying what is the emotion that you're feeling, what do you think that it tells you about what could or should be different, and moves on from there.
Well, thank you. I want to throw this out again. This is really for my audience's benefits. Some have heard this before, others are listening for the first time. But in my entire professional career, I think, I served in the Marine Corps for 24 years. Then I went into business, and I was immediately a very senior executive in a publicly traded company for 15 years. And about midway through that 15 years, the CEO said, Mike, more so than anyone on our executive team, you are relentlessly professionally curious. And I was like, that's a good thing, right? He goes, it's a great thing. He said, Mike, you're always reading. You're always coming to the hey, did you see the New York Times article today? Hey, in Wired magazine and MIT magazine, you're always throwing things out. And he said, I just wish that I had more of that, and I wish others had more of that, because we become creatures of habits. And so I throw that out, and I'd like you to talk about this. I told people, and then I think that they hired me, that company hired me to start a leadership development program, which I felt entirely comfortable doing based upon my Marine Corps background. And I found that I led Marines and civilian businessmen and women exactly the same. That stuns some people to hear that. But the common denominator is human beings and human nature. And so it really was, I had no problem seamlessly getting in there. I had a lot to learn about business. But where I'm going with this, aside from that leadership development program, within 2 years, they appointed me the CIO. Now I'm not a techie. In fact, 2 years earlier, computers were new. When I retired from the Marine Corps in '98, I wasn't really all that sure how to save a file. And I always had to ask a young guy, remind me how to forward an attachment. So imagine my Marine buddies when I told them, well, they just put me in charge of the 176 man and women technology department, $45 million budget. They're like, but Mike, you don't know anything about it. I said, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here for leadership and organizational skills. Then they lumped HR, then marketing, internet operations, part of finance. So my point in saying this, and I'm supporting you, indirectly, your comments here, is I was not blessed with what I called the curse of knowledge. I knew nothing about any of this. And I've heard that curse be called the curse of knowledge, the curse of experience, the curse of habit. And I wasn't afflicted with any of that. So people respected me. They knew I was there to help them. And so I was asking all sorts of questions. And I used to say, this might be a dumb question. And I would ask, and I would say at least 50% of the time, Dr. Golden, when I asked the question, the subject matter experts around the table looked at each other like, that's a pretty good question, and we don't have an answer for that. We've always done it this way. And so that professional curiosity and relentless asking of questions became the watchword, and it really sparked creativity. And we broke a lot of paradigms. We just broke a lot of paradigms, especially in the technology space where, and I use the auto industry as an analogy, if you're raised a Ford guy by your dad, you tend to buy Fords because Chevys are junk. If you're raised a Chevy, and so Pete, there's a lot of parochialism, provincial thinking. In the technology space, I find that if a certain person liked a certain technology stack or software as a service, they tended to use that as a solution for everything. And they never even considered Ford, Mercedes, Dodge or BMW. They never even consider, because they are a Chevy guy. And so I am supporting what you're saying. I just wanted to think, do you have any thoughts about this? Because there's other leaders out there that either are or will be put in charge of something they have no knowledge, no formal training or education, no experience in. And I think their success really largely is going to depend on them being able to ask these questions and really demand people to give them their best answers and then go from there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you're making me think of a framework that I don't think that there's a publication with this in it yet, so stay tuned. But I think of it as a three-legged tool for creative growth, and there's deconstruction, there's imagination, and there's action. And under deconstruction, I think a lot about bottom-up processing. As leaders, as a neurodivergent person, I tend to be a bottom-up processor, which actually makes me a systems thinker. Sometimes we reverse this and we think that like, oh, the systems thinker is the person who sees the big picture and they're not worried about the details. And I think that it's essential to be, in some sense, to bring a bottom-up processing idea to your work, to constantly ask questions. And the reason is that sometimes our work, just like you're saying, here's the way that we've always done it. We have this idea of like, here's how you approach a certain kind of problem or a certain kind of product or service or whatever the case might be. Sometimes we approach that, I like to describe it as like a castle that's made of Legos. And we know that we have a toy castle. We do not recognize that it's actually made up of little plastic bricks. And therefore, we never know that we can take that castle apart and make something else with it. We could make a spaceship with it. We could make a bridge with it. We just keep, we're like, well, here we have a castle. Maybe we can make cool landscaping around it. Or maybe we can add flourishes, like new flags to the top of it. Like we're redecorating the castle, but we're never taking it apart and figuring out what else those bricks could be. You need somebody who can see that this structure that we have is just one iteration of a whole bunch of different decisions and elements. And I know oftentimes we criticize people for not being able to see the forest for the trees. And I'm often telling my clients and audiences wherever that the far more common problem, in my experience, the far more common problem is that people stop being able to see the trees as soon as you tell them it's a forest. They're just like, I got this whole thing. Here's what I got. I'm going to work with this huge thing, just like that castle. And I don't understand that it's made up of elements that could be changed, that could be questioned. I could identify some other element. Do we have all the pieces here that we want? Is this the optimal configuration of them? Are we missing some things? Are some of these pieces completely extraneous? Could we be building something completely different? So that deconstruction of things as they are, so that we recognize that they could go together in multiple different ways. And when you have that kind of thinker, what you also have is the person who's like, why are we doing it this way? Like, since we have all of these different toy bricks that we could put together in any way, I'm going to be the person who asks, why is it put together this way? And if I get a satisfactory answer, I'll be like, cool. But if I don't get a satisfactory answer, I'm probably going to wind up being that leader who's like, well, let's figure out the best, more like optimal way. And so whether it's a Ford or a Chevy, to use your metaphor, isn't going to matter as much as like, what is our goal and what is it that we need in order to reach that goal? But in order to have that mentality, you have to be able to deconstruct things as they are. And that goes back to that refusal to accept that things just are as they are, that they're actually made up of a lot of different parts and decisions and components, all of which can be identified and questioned and creatively reimagined.
Thank you for that. Well, we're back to some standard questions I ask all the guests, and you've been blessed to work with, study, coach, observe a lot of leaders. And so it's a two-sided question. The first side of the coin is, have you identified any traits, habits, and skills that are common to the most effective leaders? And if you want to swap out effective for creative, have at it. And then I'm going to follow it up with, well, we got to talk about the other ones. Can you identify traits, habits, and skills that are also common to the most ineffective or non-creative leaders? Creativity is just not their thing whatsoever. So let's start with the good end of the bell curve first. Any traits, habits, and skills that you found most of the very best creative leaders possess in common?
Yes, the most prominent one that comes to mind is effective leaders know how to question. things and they courageously question things. And again, like I said earlier, it's not just for the sake of questioning it and being a contrarian or being like, I'm just going to like problematize everything and criticize everything. Asking a question about something isn't inherently a criticism of it. It should be motivated by a genuine curiosity. Or not should, but that's my bias. I think that like when you're motivated by a genuine curiosity, you're likely to get the better answers and the better outcomes. But an effective leader is somebody who questions things as they are, and not because the person assumes that things as they are is a mistake or is worth criticizing, but because they know that how things are is just how they are. It's not how they must be, right? James Baldwin, who we quoted earlier, also said, the world is before you and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. And I think the most effective leaders are people who know that through and through, whether it's in their job, their workplace, or whether it's in their own life, their relationships. They know that however things are is just how they are right now. It is not how they must be. These things are neither fated nor fixed. Their change is possible. Not all of us at an individual level can effect the changes that we imagine, but we can be part of a change that we imagine. But that has to begin with our ability to refuse to believe that things, however things are handed to us, however things have been described to us, is the inevitable way, is the only way, is the optimal way. Sometimes we'll question it and we'll be like, yeah, that was the optimal way. Great. And like I said, then we have a new kind of ownership and confidence in that work, and we can continue to question ourselves as we do that work. But that's by far, I think, the most valuable set in a leader.
Well said. Well, let's migrate toward the not so good end of the bell curve. Any traits, habits, skills, or lack thereof that are common to the most ineffective leaders?
I think it can vary because it depends on what kind of ineffectiveness you're talking about. But because a person can be really good at getting people to rally behind them, but they're aiming towards something that's truly awful and egregious, right? So that would be very ineffective, but that's ineffective in a different way than somebody who cannot get people to follow them or listen to them, So it depends on what you're talking about. But I think a couple things come to mind. A lack of imagination is a big part of it, I think. And I'll say it this way, that a lack of imagination, it's not just that when we lack imagination, we fail to have cool new ideas, we fail to come up with a bold vision for the future or things like that. It's also that our lack of imagination is often what keeps us from asking questions. It keeps us from confronting difficulty. Because if we can't imagine that our lives or our work could be different, then we are scared to question it as it is right now. So the ability to imagine is what gives us the confidence and the ability to ask the questions in the first place, because we know that if we ask a question and we realize that how we're doing things is not optimal, we realize that our job isn't the job that we were meant to be in, or the product that we've designed is going to be a failure. If we are people who are able to imagine, we know that that's not the end of the story. We know there's going to be something on the other side of that question that we've asked. If we don't have any sense of imagination and we can only do what we've seen done before, then we will unconsciously often keep ourselves from asking the questions because we don't know what to do with them once they've been asked, right? So that holds a lot of people back from being able to make really necessary decisions. I often tell my clients that your growth, your positive change is always on the other side of a question you haven't asked, always. Right. And there are many things that can help us to get to those questions and to ask them. But a part of what we need is an ability to imagine that once we have asked them, well, I'll just say it this way. We have to be able to imagine that we can survive the question or we won't ask it. Not even on purpose. We'll just unconsciously, subconsciously censor the question so that we can keep ourselves safe. And that imagination, the lack of it keeps us from a lot of growth and a lot of, so much positive change and positive opportunities.
Thank you for that. Well, let's take that question and just bump it up a level. So we talked about leaders. So let's just say the leaders you were talking about were, really it was a general question, leaders at every level, but let's say it was focused on executives. This next question is focused on executives. And let's talk about leadership teams, the top leadership, the executive team, the top 6, 8, or 10, however, C-level people and other senior executives. Can you identify any leadership, cultural, organizational attributes that are common to the most effective leadership teams? And then, of course, I'm going to follow that up with the other end of the bell curve. Same question. What about ineffective teams? Are there also leadership, cultural, and organizational deficiencies that most of them seem to share in common? So let's start with the good end first.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind, I feel like I could probably get into this all day, but the first thing that comes to mind, Mike, is for effective executive teams. I think what I've seen be truly, for people who are change makers, who want to do good in the world, I think they have a way of connecting their work, whatever their purpose is of the executive team, whatever that institution is, whatever that company is. They have a way of genuinely and meaningfully connecting that work with something bigger than just that company, something bigger than just profits, something bigger than just hey, we're going to make the best product or service in this industry. I think that teams, if the highest bar that they have is exceeding the number from the year before, if the highest bar that they have is getting the celebration across a stage at their annual meeting, they can get a lot done, and that can be very rewarding for a lot of people. But the most effective work that I've seen is teams that know how to connect whatever it is that their team is doing, whatever it is that their company is doing, whatever it is that their institution is doing, with something larger about the human experience, something that can be something about community growth, giving back. It can be something about changing society, changing policies for the better. I do trainings regularly in mental health and trauma-informed practice for people who are in roles where they don't typically get this kind of training, because I found that it's necessary everywhere, but it's also something that fosters a lot of creativity for people. Once we know how the human brain works and how our mental health works, we wind up ideating in different ways. And what I often share in those trainings is that changing the world is part of how people heal. And teams, including executive teams, that can see their work within the umbrella of changing the world for the better, and not just whatever it is that they're kind of like carefully crafted mission or vision statement already says, they wind up inspiring a lot of greater good, and including greater success for their kind of narrower goals. But bringing people behind you because they feel like they're part of something larger than themselves. And that something that's larger than themselves isn't just the company they're part of. It's a community, it's a world, it's a vision for the future.
So what about the other end, same thing. Are there any common attributes for the leadership teams that seem to be very rigid-minded, not creative at all, and they are going to follow the process even if it's 35 years old? They are just stuck in that.
Well, I think that you've indicated perhaps with your question there, perhaps the drawbacks of that mentality. I mean, of course, it can be really valuable to honor practices of the past, to honor rituals and traditions, and to recognize and esteem the things that people in the past have done that got them to where they are, or got our institutions to where they are. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and it's important to honor that. But I think that sometimes we mistake the concept of honoring something with the concept of repeating it, and those are not inevitably the same things. And so I think for the people who find themselves stuck, sometimes they find themselves stuck doing the same thing because they think that they have to honor the past. Sometimes they are stuck doing the same things because that's the only thing that they know to do. They don't have an imagination to think of a different way to do it. And hey, I've gotten this far doing this, I'm just going to keep doing this. Sometimes people get stuck because there's not an incentive for them to not be stuck. If all that they're doing is, they're there to put in their time and labor and get a paycheck. And if that's the way that the leadership has sort of like made that this is what we're all doing together, is we're just making an income, then I'm not sure what incentive they would have to contribute their cognitive and creative capacity to that role, versus maybe they leave that role where they're seemingly stuck and they go home and do lots of brilliant creative things, right? So there's also sometimes a lack of incentive, or, why would I pour my creative energy? I only have so much of it. Why would I pour it into this role instead of into my family, into something else? So there's some other things that we can look at there. But yeah, when we get stuck in doing things a certain way, when we don't have a sense of imagination, it's not only that we might, continue doing things past the point of their effectiveness, but we also miss a lot of opportunities to change, to adapt, to find new collaborations. Maybe the thing that we've done in the past, the service we've offered, the product we've created, whatever, is going to completely change over time, but we miss those opportunities if we're just stuck on the treadmill.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to throw this question out at you. You've used the term neurodivergent, I think, at least twice in this episode. And I tell people I'm the world's oldest leadership student. It's never over. And I know there's people older than me, but the fact is, I'm dating myself here, but I was in my very first leadership role 50 years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
When I was 18, I suddenly was in charge of 12 other Marines. And so I've been at this game quite a bit in various environments. And Dr. Golden, not a week goes by that I don't learn something like, how did I not hear about this? I'm 68 years old. I'm at the height of my game, and I've never read that or heard. If I knew that, I would have been even better, And so I am increasingly seeing and hearing the term neurodivergent leadership. And I'm asking this as much for me as the audience. I think some of the audience has already heard it too. But I think a large part of the audience, it's going to be the very first time they've ever heard that term. And I would like to hear your thoughts on, is there a official definition of what that is? And or what's your interpretation, and how does it apply to leadership? Is it a good thing? Do you want neurodivergent leaders in? I think some people will sit there and hear you talk and say, my God, I think I'm one of them. Or, you know what? Susie's one of them. I work with Susie and she's exempt. So I'll shut up now. I'm rambling. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I think absolutely among your listeners, they are probably already aware of it, or definitely could peg themselves as neurodivergent, especially if they are really interested in the topic of leadership, if that's a special interest of yours, a hyper-focus sometimes. But yeah, neurodivergence can include a lot of different things, typically ADHD, autism, some forms of, other cognitive differences, the ways that we think. We refer to it sometimes. The concept of neurodiversity is often offered in place of concepts of pathologizing different ways that people's brains work. So recognizing that there are different neurotypes, that the ADHD brain, for example, doesn't operate the same way as the non-ADHD brain. That doesn't mean that the ADHD brain is bad or is sick. It just means that it operates differently. It might need different kinds of stimuli or less stimuli than somebody else's. There are many different definitions of neurodiversity, and I would encourage listeners to go look them up. There are also really interesting thinkers who have said things like they don't necessarily believe that there is any such thing as a neurotypical brain, but there are people who are maybe more able to get their brains to follow along what society expects. And so they can kind of look more neurotypical than other people, act more neurotypical, but everybody has, different brains that need different kinds of accommodations. But we might say that those who are neurodivergent are those who, whose brains operate in a way that society isn't necessarily typically as friendly to. And we might need to say, hey, I need less stimulus, less sensory. We might be more likely to get sensory overloaded or need sensory engagement in order to pay attention, these different kinds of things. And I will say neurodiversity in the workplace is well acknowledged and studied to be absolutely advantageous to your workplace. It's basically different types of brains that think differently, that perceive differently. And you can imagine how valuable that would be when you're facing problems, to have different people who just literally perceive their world and their reality differently. And when you bring those people together, what do they come up with versus everybody who's kind of seeing everything the exact same way? They're not necessarily benefiting one another in the same way, right? So the neurodiversity in the workplace and how you can accommodate that and nurture that, make your space, make your workplace and your teams that you're leading places where it's welcoming and people are free to have the neurotype, to have the brain activity that they have, the cognitive inclinations that they have, that's going to benefit your team in the long run.
Oh, I love it. Well, listen, our time is coming to an end, Dr. Golden, but I can't let you out of here without asking you the fantasy question that I ask all guests. If you were able to bring back one leader from the past and spend a day with that person, who would you choose and why?
Oh, in a heartbeat, I would choose James Baldwin. And, I've quoted him a couple of times. He and his work have been a North Star for me for a very long time. But I would love to have his insight in what he sees about like what's going on in our world right now, from politics to technology changes to the different ways that communities are made, the different ways that people help and build up one another. I would love to ask him all kinds of questions about what he perceives the world to, be doing right now and what he would recommend. He's always been such a truth teller, and he often wrote about how, the truth is at odds with what most people want to know about themselves. But he saw it as his task to show people what they weren't necessarily ready or willing to look at for themselves. And so you bring a person like that into any occasion. Bring him into 2025. I wish I could know what he would have to say.
Very good choice. I've never heard of him before I saw that quote, and I made a note to, look this guy up. I think he's got value to add. So I look forward to reading up on him and maybe benefiting from some of his wisdom. Well, listen, it's been a great episode. The audience is going to love it, I'm sure. And I'm also sure that some people are going to want to reach out to you. How do listeners find out more about you and contact you if they'd like to?
Oh, thank you. Yes, like I said earlier, I made a custom website just for listeners of this podcast. So it's not for everybody else. It's just for you all. And it's tashagolden.com/Fidelis. So tashagolden.com/Fidelis. And I will have links to some of the things that we've mentioned here. You might also have them in your show notes, but we'll just make double sure that everybody gets them. So the Psychology Today article that we mentioned, some of the LinkedIn posts that Mike read the 5 questions from, I'll maybe put some of the content there so you can find it easily, and some ways to work with me, whether that's for consulting and building your creative leadership, or whether that's speaking engagements or the mental health training. There'll be information up there for you all, a couple of free resources for you to download as well.
Well, thank you for doing that, and we will include that link in the show notes when the podcast episode is published. Well, listen, Dr. Golden, it's been a delightful episode. It's far exceeded my expectations. I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and insights with the audience. They're going to love it, and I respectfully ask that you consider coming back someday and doing another one on maybe a little bit different topic or a deeper dive into some of the things that are your most favorite that you think most leaders need to hear. So thank you again. I really appreciate you showing up here and sharing your thoughts with us. It was a great time.
Thank you so much. It's so glad to be here and looking forward to hearing all of the creative things that your listeners get up to.
Great. Well, be well, Dr. Golden.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.